Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure to present to you Jonas Staal, who just came from Amsterdam in order to take part in the Vienna Humanities Festival and also in a talk within the Vienna Contemporary Fair. Jonas Staal is an artist whose work situates itself between art and social and political engagement. I would say that if there is a red thread going through his works, that would be as if, at least as I see it, that wherever Jonas sees a certain sort of injustice in society, he tries to intervene, and he intervenes with artistic language that is very political, and that involves an action. I will just mention some of the projects that he's working on, and usually his engagement as an artist, which I find also significant for your work, is that they're long-term engagements. So it's not one-off pieces of work or exhibitions, but rather long-term engagement with a topic. So in 2012, Jonas initiated the New World Summit, which he will tell us more about, but basically it's a forum where political movements that have been suppressed, banned, censored from around the world gathering together, and what he does, again, at least as I see it, is creating a forum for discussion between them, a forum which gives their ideas the chance to be heard. More recently, actually last year, he started a project called New Unions, where it's another type of injustice that he engages with, which is more the social injustice. So we have a set of very many interesting questions to talk about, but first of all, welcome. Welcome to Vienna, welcome to the Humanities Festival. When we discussed this conversation, you said that actually you don't feel very comfortable with the concept that what you're doing is giving voice to political movements that have hard times being heard. So tell us about what you do. If not this.
The first half hour
yeah,
now?
yeah.
Okay. Thank you for this introduction and for welcoming me here in Vienna, and thank you for coming here. I hear a huge amount of echo. Can you understand what I say, or is it? I think I have to talk like a priest in the Evangelische Schule, so I really have to take a lot of time to let the words kind of circulate through the building. So, the theme of this festival is revolutions, and I want to share with you a couple of projects that discuss a couple of projects with you that relate specifically to the overlaps between the domains of art and politics. But I think it's important to start with acknowledging that as far as there are any revolutions taking place today, I would say there are a manifold. One of them is maybe not the idealized leftist, progressive, emancipatory revolution that we might want to read into the past when it comes to the Spanish Civil War and the communalist resistance against the Franco regime, and it's not the early years of the Russian Revolution, and it's not the coalitions between workers and students of May '68. It is what Yanis Varoufakis refers to as the nationalist international. It is the success of a variety of extreme right, ultranationalist, if not neo-fascist movements and parties that have been taking over our governments all over Europe. Today there are the elections in Germany. The Alternative for Deutschland risks becoming the third largest party of the country. Many of our in my own country, the Freedom Party, named after the FPÖ here in Austria, is already the second largest party. You're going to have elections in a month. Last year, the FPÖ almost delivered the presidency 2 years ago, in 1 year ago. This year, it was the Front National. In that sense, the notion of revolution and the notion of internationalism, strangely, has been also recuperated by the extreme right. So I want to start, before talking about the role of art within what I call transdemocratic movements that might bring back into our imaginary, in our collective imaginary, the idea of an emancipatory or egalitarian democracy. Let's maybe first talk a bit about the role of art in the nationalist international, which is of course a paradox because the party that dominates the discussion here, the FPÖ in Austria, is in a coalition with the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, the country where I live. They are part of the same European faction. But the strange thing is, of course, is that what allies the nationalist international is that they all want to separate from each other. That the old idea of internationalism was that there would be some kind of egalitarian, emancipatory ideal that would create a commons across borders or across nations. And in this case, it's exactly the desire not to live together is what creates unity amongst the nationalist international. I want to introduce to you a fellow artist. This is Fleur Agema. And Fleur Agema is a politician. She's the number 2 of the Freedom Party in the Netherlands. The Freedom Party, in some way similar to the FPÖ, is a party that has called for the banning of headscarves in public buses. It has called to build an equivalent of Guantanamo Bay in the Netherlands. It has called upon the preemptive bombing of Iran. It is, in many ways, a symptom, an example of the ultranationalist, neo-fascist movements that we've seen emerge all over Europe. But it's a party that doesn't only attack multicultural society and the left. It is also a party that attacks artists. It's a party that really considers art and progressive artists as they literally call them the propagandists of the left, those that uphold all of the values of diversity and ambiguity and postmodern relativism, a kind of symptom, a disease of relativism that has undermined Western Judeo-Christian humanist society, which is often the kind of mythological origins of so-called European superiority. But what was interesting about Agema is that I found out that she herself studied at the same art school as myself. A very extremely progressive art school in the Netherlands, very anarchist one. And it brought me to try to find out what exactly the artist Agema, 10 years before she became a politician, what exactly was it what was the kind of art or cultural vision that she had brought forward. So I went back to the archives of my art school and I found this 344-page thesis, which is called Closed Architecture. It is full of drawings and detailed descriptions by Agema of a new prison model that she aimed to realize in an old military-industrial complex in the northern part of the Netherlands. And at the moment that I found this thesis, it was the first time that her political party actually joined government. This was 2010, and the thesis she wrote 2004. So I started to research into this thesis to find out at what level did the artist Agema, this prison model that the artist Agema developed, at what level is it being realized 6 years later, now that Agema has joined the Dutch government. So I would consider myself, you could call me a political artist, but in this case we have an artist-politician. It's the reversed trajectory. This is the book that resulted from this research, Closed Architecture. It's a project by me, but based on the concept of Agema. It's an attempt to exactly reconstruct the prison model that she had in mind. This is an original drawing. It is a prison model that is devised in 4 phases, from dark to light. And the idea is that the prisoner starts in this first phase, which Agema calls the bunker. So this is an extremely isolated environment. There's only one window, very little light. It is a space of isolation, of discipline, of punishment. It is literally a very dark environment. This is a 3D reconstruction that I made with the architects based on her drawing and descriptions. And it's a very modular space. You can see that it almost has this Lego kind of logic, which can very easily expand, which is going to be a bit difficult for you to see on these small monitors. But here you can see the reconstruction of the phases that come afterwards. So the idea is that if a prisoner shows proper behavior, they will move through to a next level of the prison. And the next level means one extra window, more light, certain luxury products, maybe even a private computer that provide the incentives, almost like a game show, to move forward into the prison. Bad behavior means the prisoner goes backward in the prison. And this is also the radicality of her proposal of this model. She says prisoners should no longer be punished to, I don't know, let's say I have committed fraud, I'm punished for 10 years of prison. In principle, 10 years is 10 years. It doesn't suddenly become 15 years. But in this model, if I do not follow the learning objectives of each of the phases, of each of the game levels, then I am sent backwards into the prison. If I ideologically refuse the idea of this prison, I will stay in the first phase forever, which makes it a perfect model to isolate dissident voices, to isolate activists, to isolate people that do not just commit crimes, formal crimes, but people that reject the very structure of the state that this prison represents. The most interesting part of the prison model that she developed is the 4 phase. In the previous ones you saw that the prison literally becomes lighter, the color of it, more light, more windows inside. The 4 phase, something else happens. Here you see the original drawing and here the digital reconstruction. The 4th phase of the model is called the light. The first one was the bunker, the last one is the light. And it is modeled almost like an upper middle class neighborhood. Luxury apartments, and this whole previous modular logic kind of disappears. A lot of recreational space around the buildings and no more guards. 24-hour camera protection. Which makes the final phase of this model almost like a phase in which the prisoner is not necessarily sure that they are still inside the prison or if they're already outside. The inside of the prison is modeled on the outside of the society surrounding the prison. And this, I think, is at the end the most important thing that we can learn from this ultra-nationalist imaginary, in this case in the form of art, in the form of architecture. That this is not so much a prison model, this is a model of society becoming prison, in which in and outside, in the logic of the society of control, becomes completely obliterated. And in which dissidence, in which the mechanisms of this society structurally isolates dissidence and difference for anyone who doesn't agree or doesn't subject to the conditions that allow you to liberate yourself through the prison model. This project took many forms, architectural models, films, the digital reconstructions that I just showed you before. Also a reconstruction in a theater in the city of Amsterdam, Frascati Theater that you see here, which are the exact reconstructions of each of the phases of the prison model, in which I invited artists, sociologists, journalists to collectively reflect on the process in which, through the participation of Freedom Party to our government, our society is becoming modeled after this kind of ideological propositions like the one Agema proposes in closed architecture. At the same time, this research into the transformation of certain social democratic ideals that were still very prominent in the Netherlands up until 15 years ago into a disciplinary model of society, a society of control. I realize that it is easier to analyze these processes than to imagine their counterpart. It's easier to imagine closed society than open society. It's easier to critique the extreme right than to propose an alternative, than to imagine what could be better, what could be different. We're more unified when we have a common enemy, but to think beyond what defeating that enemy means is much more difficult. And these questions brought to being another project, an artistic and political organization that I call the New World Summit. It's a collaboration between myself as an artist with architects, designers, people from the field of diplomacy and conflict studies. And our aim is to create alternative parliaments for stateless and blacklisted political organizations. So organizations who, particularly in the war on terror of the past 15 years, have been excluded from democratic processes. Being placed on a blacklist today, it means your bank accounts are frozen, your passport is revoked, a travel ban is imposed. It literally means that you are declared stateless, that you do no longer exist in a space of political recognition in what we call democracy. And the perversity of that is, of course, that the process of blacklisting happens exactly in the name of democracy. So the idea is, in order for democracy to defend itself against its enemies, we must exclude them from the very idea of what democracy is supposed to be. What you see here is the first temporary parliament that we created in the Sophienseele in Berlin, in which we invited organizations, political representatives from all political parties that are today blacklisted in the context of Europe, United States, Australia. It was a combination of all the blacklists that have emerged since the start of the war on terror. So the flags you see all around this parliament belong to these organizations blacklisted today. And our question was, if we are able to bring these different organizations together, in this case you see here John Andoni Leque from the Basque Independence Movement, Fadil Yildirim from the Kurdish Women's Movement, Louis Alandoni from the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, and all the way on the right, Moussa Ag Assarid from the National Liberation Movement of Azawad. If we are able to bring these organizations together, could it be that between those people in whose name the war on terror is waged, like ourselves, and the people against who the war on terror is waged, there might be more in common than with the states that say that they speak in our name and the states that destroy others in our name, destroy those who are blacklisted today. So it was meant as a space of assembly between the stated and the stateless, those who are living in existing states but reject their policies, and those who are being aggressed by exactly these policies. It was an attempt to reimagine, through this alternative parliament, through a stateless parliament, a new coalition between the stated and the stateless. Here you see another example of such an alternative parliament in the Royal Flemish Theatre in Brussels, where we did not only focus on the blacklist, but also on the notion of statelessness in a more general sense. There were 25 representatives of unrecognized stateless states all over the world that gathered here in 2014. On the left, Ag Assarid, that was also in the previous assembly, and on the right, Sigurd Geleta from the Oromo Liberation Front in present-day Ethiopia. And we've continued that process of constructing alternative parliaments here in the city of Utrecht in the Netherlands in 2016. An important place, a university, the aula of the University of Utrecht, where in 1579 the Union of Utrecht was signed, the first document that created a confederation of all the provinces in the Netherlands, and in some way it is considered as the origin, the foundation of the modern Dutch state. So to return there with different speakers from blacklisted organizations, stateless movement, in this case also refugee organizations, political organizations of undocumented migrants and refugees, autonomist movements. It was a way to return to these origins of the state and to ask the questions, what would be its alternatives? What has the state become today, and what is our collective imaginary of how to regain some of the emancipatory promises that also were part of the idea of the state in different phases in history. The most important work, I believe, that we have been able to do as the New World Summit was not a project that we initiated ourselves, but was a project that we were commissioned to create by the democratic self-administration of Rojava. Rojava is the area in the northern part of Syria that you see here in yellow, surrounded by the Islamic State. These are the black territories in the north, Erdogan regime. The red parts are the Assad regime, and the green parts are several remaining fragments of what once was the Free Syrian Army, but unfortunately also has translated or has been transformed into Al-Nusra Front and other radical or ultra-fundamentalist groups that are part of the of the Syrian civil war, of the ongoing Syrian civil war. This northern part of Syria, Rojava, which means west, refers to the western part of Kurdistan, was declared autonomous at the beginning of the Syrian civil war in 2012. And here you see some images that I made when I was invited to document the process in which the autonomous government of Rojava is trying to create its own independent state, or its own, not exactly state, its own independent region. Maybe this is an image that is familiar to some of you, the fighters of the women's protection units, the People's Army, the Women's Army of the Rojavan independence movement that is fighting at the front lines against the Islamic State. This is an image that has been circulating in the media a lot, but less known is the alternative democratic model that has been developed in this autonomous region since 2012, which is known as democratic confederalism, and which Kurdish revolutionary Abdullah Öcalan explains as democracy without the state, a form of stateless democracy. And maybe an image that illustrates this model best is here in the theater, an old theater in the city of Gamishlo, where local communes from the region use the theater as a local people's parliament. The core idea of democratic confederalism, the core idea of stateless democracy, is that it is a project of local self-governance of hundreds of different communes who hold most power, whereas overarching structures like municipal structures, cantonal structures, transcantonal structures have less power. So in some ways you can compare it to national state, municipal level, etc. But it is a reversed political project with a strong emphasis on gender equality, which is represented by the women's protection units who have their own independent armies, and by models of communal economy, so non-capitalist forms of economy. Now, when visiting this region, I met Amina Osse, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the autonomous region of Rojava, and she commissioned the New World Summit to develop, together with the administration, a new public parliament. So instead of using the old structures of the Assad regime, in which many of these people's assemblies are taking place, to really rethink through the ideal of stateless democracy, what would be the new infrastructures, the new forms of governance, the new symbols that could emerge from this emancipatory democracy, from this revolutionary movement. And that resulted into this design that started from Amina's proposition that the idea of a parliament in the context of stateless democracy would have to be a public parliament. It would have to be a parliament as a public space. So no longer separated from the public space, but as a space that is also engulfed by a park that also functions as a recreational space, as a cultural space, just like the theater, which is still used as a theater, but is also used as a parliament. It is a circular space that breaks with the idea of a centralized speaker or leader, but proposes a symbol or the assembly as a form of self-representation, or an embodiment, a performative embodiment of what self-governance means. Around it are the pillars of the roof, which have key terms from the constitution of Rojava, which they refer to as the social contract, an interesting historical play to Rousseau's social contract, which has the core key terms: confederalism, gender equality, communalism, secularism. And on the rooftops there are these fragments of different flags of different organizations that engage in the day-to-day self-governance in the Rojava region. We started the construction in August 2015 as a collaboration between the New World Summit and the local self-administration. And we inaugurated, or we celebrated, the first creation of the arches with an international delegation with different participants of previous summits. So delegates from the Amazigh World Congress, delegates from the Catalan independence movement, delegates from the Scottish independence movement, the Filipino underground movement. And maybe this image, although very small, I'm always frustrated when images are very small, because at the end I can talk a lot, but it's really about what is visually manifested. I think from this image you can already see something of the actual work of this public parliament, which is not the structure, which is not the pillars, which is not the flags, but which is a as space that, once physically occupied, becomes the embodiment of what I would call a people in the making. Not a representation of the people that is, which is a typical claim of the ultra-nationalists. The people is absolute, it is designated, it is a singular people. This is the underlying rhetoric of ethno-nationalism. But a space in which a people is becoming, and it never becomes full. A people is always in the making. As far as we could consider the people as a composition or as a creative performative process, then a people is always in the making. And the work we try to do is to imagine spaces in which this idea of the people as a transitional, as a transformative concept can manifest itself. And I find this image a first and a glimpse to what this parliament hopefully can become. This is the current state of construction. The borders between Iraq and Syria have been closed for 1.5 years, so it has severely slowed down our work. But we will inaugurate the parliament in November or December this year. In the meantime, we have continued to work with the Rojava administration to try to think of what in other forms of infrastructure and models of political representation could result from this ideal of stateless democracy. We speak of stateless democracy as the model. It resulted in the stateless parliament that I showed you before. And in this case, we developed a model that we refer to as the stateless embassy. So this was a temporary embassy created in the Oslo City Hall, famous because yearly this is where the Nobel Peace Prize takes place. We created this dome, this ideological planetarium with all the universalist symbols from the Rojava movement, the stars, sun, rainbows, under which diplomats, official delegates of the Rojava administration introduced their political project, their struggle against the Islamic State, their call upon the international community for their support, for their recognition. But it was also a place where we tried to ally the Rojava movement with other progressive organizations, transdemocratic movements that are faced with not crises of the same scale, but that are trying to confront the democratic deficit, the democratic crisis in the European Union today. So to think not only of stateless democracy and of the Rojava struggle as something that demands support and recognition from the outside, but to also understand stateless democracy as something, as a model to learn from, as a model that can find translations in other regions, in other contexts. And our fight might not be the fight against the Islamic State, but it is certainly a fight against other manifestations, other forms of fascism. And in that sense, solidarity for me also means learning from and not only supporting another. This image for me is important because it shows in the middle Saleh Muslim, who is the co-president of the Democratic Union Party, one of the most important Rojavan parties. But he stands around the table with representatives of the Democracy in Europe Movement 2025, DM25, with representatives of Antarcia from Greece, Feminist Initiative from Sweden, Barcelona and Comu, the new city-state models that are emerging in Catalonia. And as such, it shows the possibility of a grander coalition, not a coalition to represent a singular worldview, a singular nation, a singular state, but to represent a variety, a plurality of worlds in the making. The new worlds in opposition to the absolute claim to the singular world. That is, that gathering that you saw around that table was also the starting point of my current work called New Unions. I will not speak about it very long because I see I only have 5 minutes left. So in short, New Unions is an attempt to continue the work of the New World Summit, but in relationship to the present-day crisis of the European Union. It is an attempt to reunionize Europe, to invite through the space of art different trans-democratic movements, platforms, political parties, organizations that are seeking for alternative pathways for future unions. And with alternative pathways, I mean pathways that go beyond the hostage of our political imagination that we are currently facing. I think Brexit was the ideal example. We are offered two choices. It is to remain and to support the Eurocratic elite and their austerity politics. I live in Athens half of the time, and I know austerity politics sounds like a neutral term, but it just means economic warfare. and it has the worst and most severe consequences for day-to-day life of people, very real consequences. You don't use tanks to invade a country, you use banks to invade a country, but it works exactly the same way. Or, on the other hand, we have the Leave campaign, and then we join all the worst nationalist nightmares, the darkest parts of European history that are re-emerging. But there must be a third option. There must be a third pathway towards alternative future unions. So in these slightly more symbolic and slightly more dark spaces of the stars of Europe, either dislocating from one another or reunionizing in a more positive reading, we have invited different political parties and movements and platforms from the European context, like here Bahram Raoufi from the Feminist Initiative, to propose what could these scripts be. Bahram proposed a feminist union. Seher Aydar from RED in Norway proposed a stateless union. Quim Arufat and Mireia Vehi from the Popular Unity candidacy in Catalonia proposed a communalist union. There must be a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh option for an actual union, one that we desire and one that we're not taken hostage of. This has also led to a collaboration with the Democracy in Europe 2025 movement, DM25, founded by Yanis Varoufakis, former Minister of Finance in Greece, and Srećko Horvat, philosopher, that are aiming to democratize the European Union, that are aiming to open up what this third way out of the remain and leave dichotomy could be. And they invited new unions to think with them what could be the imagery, what could be the symbolisms, what could be the assemblies that we associate with a pan-European movement, a movement that recognizes a Europe of many different worlds, many different nations and cultures and backgrounds, and at the same time is able to articulate what are our common interests, what are our common needs when it comes to democratize the economy, democratize healthcare, democratize politics on a variety of levels. Most fascinating for me was this double wedge in the DM25 logo, designed by composer Brian Eno, which made me think a lot of this famous constructivist work by L. Lissitzky. I have the Dutch translation here, but entitled Defeat the Whites with the Red Wedge. It made me think of this fast forward sign, and also of the fact that DM25 invited me to contribute to their work in 2017, 100 years after the Russian Revolution, about 100 years after Lissitzky imagined this new constructivist language for a new world in the making. And I imagined how could we think of this constructivist language in the process of reconstructing Europe, which would be something the constructivists would fundamentally disagree with me, because reconstruction would be the equivalent of revisionism, and to create the new must mean to destroy the old. But I don't believe that that is our task at this moment. I think our task is rather in reconstructing the commons that we are losing in our present day crisis. So I introduced these red wedges in the stars, these stars in crisis, this image of Europe reconstructing and reunionizing, which led to these different assembly designs, a bit similar to the previous ones, but an assembly of stars for an assembly of humans in the process of unionizing this pan-European ideal, in the process of re-democratizing Europe. A space where not the singular world, but the many worlds in the making to which we can commit ourselves can manifest. For me, at the end, if we want to speak of the relationship between art and politics, it must mean that we as artists cannot imagine the world anew by ourselves as individuals. The only way that we can do a modest contribution to a form of structural political change, or the democratization of Europe, or a rethinking of what an emancipatory democracy could or should be, it must mean that we have to align ourselves with emancipatory political parties, movements, unions, platforms, no matter what, so that individual imaginary can also become a collective imaginary, not for one world, but for many worlds to come. I'm at 31 minutes, so I will close it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I guess there will be many questions. Can you please show me whether you're ready with questions? Yes, let me just okay, I'll have you in mind. Just to say that I find this truly amazing, really, how by creating an architectural space which embodies the values of openness, of dialogue, the values which are in complete opposition to the values that are in the center of the work of your colleague, artist, politician, Ahma, was her name, and by inviting political groups that you see as progressive forces, as a sort of progressive revolutionary forces, but they are seen by states and by authorities as almost terrorists, right? They are blacklisted, they are not recognized, they are not given word or space in the political arena. And with this attempt, you're trying to redefine the political, create a new space for, and redefine really the political itself. But my question was, how do you select how do you distinguish between a just cause and a terrorist? Well, most of the progressive revolutionary causes were ones. Then when they succeed, they go to the history books and they're start being seen as a progressive. But you're entering in an earlier stage when they're still banned and recognized. Still, how do you recognize between a progressive force and terrorist groups?
Well, I mean,
because they are called this, aren't they?
Sure, of course. With most of the legal scholars that I speak with, made very clear to me that actually the word terrorism has no legal definition. Terrorism is nothing but it's like a bad word. It's like it's saying you are bad. But this in itself, being a terrorist has no legal definition. Even a terrorist blacklist is not based on a legal definition of a terrorist. Terrorism as such doesn't exist. It's just it's a designation. It's a way of framing an opponent. And of course, in this context, I think we should absolutely be critical of what is referred to as non-state forms of terrorism. I also believe we should be extremely critical to forms of state terrorism, illegal invasions like the one in Iraq and Afghanistan that my own state of the Netherlands has politically supported, so which we are co-responsible for, which has led to hundreds of thousands of civil deaths that are still awaiting justice, for which there are no international courts or dysfunctional courts. So I'm absolutely not against being very critical of what is often referred to as terrorist organizations. I also don't idealize the movements that participate in our summits. There are many that I fundamentally disagree with, but I defend an underlying democratic principle, which is the principle of political representation. I don't believe there is anyone in the world that exists beyond political representation. I think political representation is a principle, equal representation is a principle, which means that undocumented or stateless peoples have just as much right to political representation as stated peoples administered within a state, but that is not necessarily saying that one holds the absolute right to justice, progressiveness and emancipation and the other one does. And this of course is also something that I encounter in a lot of the works that we do, that the idea of to imagine a space of openness, there's a lot of paradox in that. Because for example, let me go back to one of the earlier image. Sorry, this is not very pleasant to look at, but like the first summit, for example, this circular space. My experience is that the most effective space when it comes to a performative dimension of democracy is to have about 250 people. As soon as you go beyond 250 people, you create a lot of alienation within the space. Like it's as if you're in a space, but you feel outside of it at the same time. So there's an importance of a physical proximity to one another, and the circle, of course, is always the strongest form in order to build a sense of communality or unity or whatever you want to call it. But at the same time, it's also an extremely aggressive form, because if you arrive at a circle of people, but you weren't part of the circle from the start, then the circle doesn't feel inclusive at all. It feels like the most exclusive form imaginable. It's a fortress, it's fortified. So there's a lot of paradoxes in exploring the idea of democracy as an open space or inclusive space or egalitarian space. You inevitably all the time are confronted with your own with inherent forms of exclusion that you you carry within yourself, that are carried within this slightly modernist, constructivist aesthetics that we develop in the New World Summit. So just to call something open or to call something democratic or egalitarian is, of course, doesn't mean that it is. And this is also, I feel, is a very important part of the process of our work, that you try to create a space not just as an absolute solution or an absolute proposition of this is what emancipatory politics is. You also create a space to confront yourself, your own structural limitations, in trying to enact such ideals. I don't know if this is clear, but...
To me it is. One last question before I open the floor. Can you define what is it in what you're trying to do politically and as a socio-political statement that needs art? Why is not journalism or political activism enough in order to achieve the goals that you... What is it that it needs art for?
Well, I mean, for me, art at the core is about morphology. So it's about a genealogy of form. It's about visual literacy. It's about being able to read the world in terms of forms and to understand what it means to intervene in the world through forms and to create new ones. So if we would simply say that there is a language and there is a language of words. Well, for me, words are also forms, but okay. Let's say there's a language and it's a language of words. There's also a language and that is a language of forms. And form impacts, has a direct impact in how we read and understand the world. So power cannot exist without form. It needs a form to manifest itself. It needs symbols, it needs its flags, its constitutions, its borders, its national colors, its parliaments. And in all of those forms, there is a presence of art, whether it is visual art or architecture or design, that contributes and legitimizes these forms. If this is the case, then it also means that as artists we have a relative power to challenge these existing forms by creating parallel parliaments, parallel courts, parallel embassies, and rethink these structures in relationship to other kinds of power. We don't have the power to change the world, but we have the power to imagine the world differently. And that means that I believe that the role of artists within alternative and emancipatory political movements is very crucial, not just as an instrument of these movements, but also as a way to critically challenge these movements themselves. Because at the end, I think form, the form of a space, its performativity, it defines a lot of its outcomes and of its possibilities. So I don't believe art and politics are the same, but I think that they mutually inform one another. But then of course is the question, what kind of politics do we want to inform as artists? Well, certainly not the nationalist international. So half the question is what kind of forms we want to create, and the other half of the question is with whom and for whom do we want to create these forms?
Let's turn to your questions. Please show me if you want to ask. Please.
My name is Anton Shekhovtsov. I'm a visiting fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences, and I have two questions. First question, probably just a point. In the beginning of your talk, you said that the fascist international or nationalist international was sort of paradox. It's not really the case. Even in fascist Italy in the 1930s, there were several projects of building a united fascist Europe. The European Union is, as a union of European nations, is not exclusively a liberal idea. And even after the Second World War, there were several conferences organized by ultranationalists who wanted to create a united Europe. That would be different from the European Union or from the economic European community, but still, there is nothing paradoxical here. And the second question is about the participants of your summits. For example, since the 90s, in the post-Soviet space, there were several unrecognized states created with the direct military support of Russia. That's the Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and now Donetsk People Republic and Luhansk People Republic. So would you welcome them as well? Thank you.
Yes, the first question, I think in the case of, there are of course a series of fundamental differences between 20th century fascism and whatever the ultra-nationalist, however we want to term the ultra-nationalist phenomenon that we're dealing with in Europe today. One of the main differences is that different fascisms in the 20th century, I would say, in my reading, did aim for an international, not an international of different recognized independent nations, but of an actual collective doctrine of brutal centralized forms of governance. This is, I think, a difference between what I would term today are is a stranger, more hybrid form of democratic fascism, in which these kind of parties, like the Freedom Party in the Netherlands, for example, truly do not want to create a one-party state. I don't even think Trump's platform necessarily wants that. They truly want to maintain democracy because there is nothing in the model of democracy as we know it today that stops them from getting power. It is even a much more effective form than hostile military takeovers and being discredited as NATO alliance members, as you can see, for example, in the case of Erdogan in Turkey. So to maintain at least a formal appearance of democracy seems to be very beneficial for contemporary forms of fascism. There's no longer necessarily a contradiction between democracy and fascism. So this, I would say, is a fundamental difference, and the other fundamental difference is that the Nationalist International has a common front, but it is a common front of separation, whereas the fascist movements were truly seeking for European unification. But maybe you can correct me historically, and I might be wrong on this, but this would be my reading. In the case of what kind of stateless entities are invited or participate to the New World Summit platform, that depends on which summit we would speak about. For example, in the case of the first New World Summit in Berlin, the one that you see here, all organizations blacklisted today were invited without any discrimination of selection. So the selection was actually an outer selection, those that the state excludes. But in the process of developing the summit, this changed. For example, in the case of the New World Summit in Brussels, we worked together with the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization that represents about 52 unrecognized states all over the world. They were the ones to which we posed the invitation. They invited their members, and this was, in that case, a direct collaboration between an artistic organization and a progressive diplomatic organization. So then the selection criteria was within the co-organizing party that we invited, that we involved. So in that sense, the criteria shift depending on the process. In the case of the New World Summit we organized with the Democratic Self-Administration of Rojava, obviously Rojava sought for possible alliances of other stateless movements that might share their idea of a stateless democracy, meaning that statelessness no longer would be a description of powerlessness, but a precondition for different practice of democracy. So to answer your question, I would answer your question within each of the different iterations, depending also on what kind of organizations we work with or collaborate with in the process. No, if that's, oh, I'm sorry, then I gave a very long answer to a question that was much more simple. Did we have those specific representatives? No. Sorry?
But they must have been invited, weren't they?
Depending on the specific context of each of the summits that I just described, if they would fit into that specific context, depending on the partners we work with, depending on the organizations we collaborate with, then the answer could be yes, but that depends.
There was another question there. Please give me a sign if you have a question in waiting.
Thank you. I would request for an elaboration on how you refer to yourself as a political artist, and as the reference that you used for Ahma, where you said she's an artist politician, and how that distinction might fall into the category, because I see what you're doing in terms of envisioning a new future as cultural politics. I think both of you, both of these groups are engaged in cultural politics. Yes. But then I would like, within, if you accept that category or concept, then how do you distinguish the political artist and the artist politician?
Yeah, I mean, simply speaking, I would say that a political artist is someone who believes that certain forms of political change cannot happen or cannot take place through the domains of politics as a governmental structure only. So that other forms of activity, other forms of engagements, and I would then call them morphological engagements that go through the domain of form, are necessary to make possible certain forms of political change. Whereas an artist politician in this case would be someone who comes from an artist background, but in the end uses ideas from the domain of art, translates ideas from the domain of art into the day-to-day practice of political governance through an existing state structure. Another example would be, for example, Rebecca Gompertz, who studied as an artist, became an abortion activist, a pro-abortion activist, and founded Women on Waves, which is the boat that takes women into extraterritorial waters from countries that are in which abortion is illegal. So by taking them into extraterritorial waters under the, in this case, Dutch flag, nationalist detail, allows to perform these actions. So she is someone who could say is an artist activist, someone who developed her, let's say, strategic and morphological perspective of the world through art, but which inspired a political infrastructure in the form of the abortion boat. Women on Waves is the organization that makes it possible to execute these, to realize these goals. But of course, I don't know if we can make such absolute formal designations, but the notion of the politician, the artist politician, came into being because of this confrontation with Agema, and also all the questions that come with it. For example, how is it possible that two people move through more or less the same educational background and context and then arrive at completely different parts of the political spectrum? This is inevitably not because one is born with a progressive compass and the other one is not. It somehow has to do with the way that our lives are formed and shaped by institutions. But why does one move in one direction and the other and the other in another? For me, that's still a puzzling question. And I know it has been for her supervisors. For example, we have a very prominent philosopher in the Netherlands that was invited to evaluate her thesis. He's a Foucault specialist. He's one of the most important Foucault specialists in the Netherlands. And he wrote a report on her thesis on closed architecture. He said, "This is brilliant. Agema has developed a new model of prison that the whole Department of Justice of the Netherlands couldn't do in 10 years. And then 6 years later, he wakes up with sweat on his forehead because he realizes that he just gave an A+ status to someone who's become one of the most notorious right-wing politicians of our country. But he presumed that because she was an artist, she must mean it well." Which also says something about maybe an overly trust that we have in art and artists and all of the humanistic ideals that we attribute to art, but really depends in what context they are employed. Now I'm very much off subject, but apology.
Does anyone have more questions? Please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Pia, and I got a similar question, but according to the Syrian project you described, it's current, right? I assume, yeah. Can you see, or it's more like a practical question, maybe what you describe now, maybe not as practical, it should be within the response now. Can you imagine, or can you see within this project, within this interventional forms you described as your own artistic method, can you see within, or can you imagine within this project, within your artistic work as an interventional forms, any kind of real or practical societal practical outcome of this project?
I mean, yes, insofar that this public parliament is commissioned by and developed with the democratic self-administration of Rojava, and once it is inaugurated, it will be used for the day-to-day gatherings of local communes from the city of Derk, in this case in particular, in the canton of Jazira, which is all the way in the eastern part of Rojava. And on top of that, it is a space that will be used as a site of public recreation, but also of cultural events and international conferences, because it's the city is located very close to the Iraqi-Syrian border. So any delegates or any international political parties or negotiation teams will move through this city first before they arrive into any other city. So in that sense, it's also a symbolical landmark of the political project that is being realized in the region. So yes, it has an actual political purpose, and the reason why is because it is developed directly with a political organization who had that purpose clear at forehand. So the political legitimacy is partly given by the commissioning partner in that sense, and collaborator. Was that the main aim? I mean, for me, the main aim is to explore how alternative political ideals allow for alternative visual forms. So I believe that art, for a large, art is an expression of, always has been an expression and always stood in relationship to dominant structures of power. As these structures of power changed, art changed as well. But through art, these structures of power changed too. So politics is not independent from art. We always say, like, but then is art still autonomous? Is art independent? Isn't it an instrument of politics? Yes, but maybe politics is also an instrument of art. So let's not grant politics too much privilege when it comes to how much impact it has on art. We have an impact on politics as well. As far as we recognize the relative power of the imagination, of symbolism, of visual literacy that we can contribute and through which we can intervene and direct in political processes. Obviously, as long as we do not have the monopoly on power, we always stand on the losing side somewhat. But that doesn't mean that the imaginary is powerless per se.
One question that follows a little bit on your question. What is the impact that you already see on the public debate on these banned movements in your country, in other countries where you do your project? And can you envisage that this change or impact can lead to change in politics?
I mean, yes, but I think that if you want to imagine political change, it means that you commit to a project or to an ideal and you work on it for a lifetime, and then in that lifetime maybe you are able to modestly co-direct in a coalition of many other civil organizations, unions, political parties, you name it. You might be able to move something slightly more to one side than to another. I don't believe that any individual or any individual artist, however powerful their work or their imagination, can change the world as such. And I think that it is also, and if they could, then I think that this would be a big problem, because whenever there is a singular person who believes that they can change the world, this generally doesn't tend to lead to the best results. So to work in coalitions in some way is also the strongest antidote to forms of totalitarian governance. To recognize ourselves as recognize ourselves as artists in working on a collective imagination, instead of our individual imagination as a kind of dictate or dictatorial form of imaginary, is maybe in itself a prefiguration or a pre-enactment of the possibility of democratic systems and structures or democratic changes in the future. This is also, I think, quite important, that the way we work is, of course, just as important as what we try to realize. In the case of the stateless parliament, for example, the parliament for Rojava, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amina also, was the one who commissioned us the parliament. But because of this reversed power structure in Rojava, she can commission us, but she cannot decide that it has to be made. The plan has to be proposed to each of the different communes of the city of Derek who have their input, because they are the ones who are going to be using this space on a day-to-day basis. And only through that whole process is it possible for this project to be realized. Which means that the form of the parliament also changes through the process. So it's a parliament for stateless democracy, but we also followed the method of stateless democracy to create the parliament, if you understand what I mean. So this is why what for me is so important in emphasizing this coalitional, this element, that dimension of a coalition behind an artwork that supports the artwork and that is supported by the artwork.
An artist might not be able to change the world alone, but certainly can create new worlds. Thank you, Jonas Staal, for being with us at the Vienna Humanities Festival.